Hi there. I was recently given the privilege and the responsibility of updating the model-driven Power App documentation. Now, what I'd like to do is to talk about the changes that were made and how you can go through there and understand the documentation that little bit better. So what I'm going to be covering is where to find the documentation, just so you can navigate there properly. I'm also going to say, well, why did we update it at all? What was the background into needing any documentation updates? I'm going to talk about the landing page itself, because that really is the start point for anyone's journey with regards to looking at the documentation. And then I'm also going to point out the glossary, which was a really key page that was introduced into the documentation to make it a little bit easier to understand some of the features around model-driven apps and how they work. I'll also talk about the structure, because there's a navigation structure that it's important to understand, and there are some changes that have been made to the navigation structure. I will point those out. As I say, navigation structure is an important thing. And really just remind ourselves, look, model-driven apps, they sound a bit strange, and sometimes it's easier to think about them as data model-driven apps rather than just straight model-driven apps, because it's like there's a word missing from it. But you know, model-driven app is how we refer to these types of apps. I'm going to talk about new pages that have been introduced. There aren't a whole lot of new pages that have been introduced, but there are some, and it's worth noting what they are. A little bit of point about next steps. A lot of the pages have got one element which says, hey, next steps. I just want to talk to you a little bit about that. And that takes us to the end of the introduction to model-driven app documentation updates. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over and just show you all of those points in one go. By way of a reminder, this is a model-driven app. It happens to be a dashboard, and we can see there's lots of tables associated with them. This is an accounts table. It's not actually heavily used in this particular app, but there are lots of other tables that are used. You can see that you can actually switch between different views. There aren't very many views as it happens in here, but you can switch between them, and you can also navigate to different elements, and then you can see related entities and so on. That's what makes this particular tool very powerful. Allows you to navigate through. The relationships are very strong within there. That essentially is a model-driven app. It's certainly a very simple model-driven app in this case. I'm now going to switch over to take a look about how to find them. As ever, the easiest way of finding something on the web is by going to a search. So I would typically go to model-driven app documentation. That should get us pretty close, and you can actually see that that's going to take us possibly not to the root of it. I think this does take us to the root there. And so we're now at the root of the model-driven apps documentation. Now, the first question I wanted to address was, why update this at all? Now, obviously, this is the updated version. You're not looking at the older version, but the broad reasons for updating it is because the product has changed. It does different things to what it used to do. The screens have changed, and therefore there'll be certain features that the way in which the screens work that will have changed. There are changes in that respect, but also the priorities within model-driven apps have changed as well. And by that I mean that we have more modern ways of doing things in model-driven apps than we used to have, and that means the priorities as far as the documentation also needed to reflect that. So moving on, I just wanted to make the point about the glossary. There is an important feature here. Now, you can get to the glossary of terms in a number of ways. You can either get to it through the main navigation, or you can get to it through the hierarchical structure that you can see here. Now, the reason why the glossary is important is because in a lot of cases, a lot of the pages will reference this glossary of terms. And the reason for that is because I didn't want people to leave this model-driven apps area. If they want to leave it, that's fine. But I didn't really want them to jump straight out and end up in an area they weren't expecting to be in. And so I'll give you an example of how this works. So take something like tables, for example. Now, tables are fundamental to model-driven apps. Model-driven apps don't exist without them. So if you head to tables, it's going to take you to the glossary of terms. You're still in model-driven apps at this point, but if you want to find out more about configuring tables, it's going to take you away from the tables element of the glossary, and it's going to take you down to Dataverse. And so just notice at the top that the URL will change, and it'll change to say data platform. So if I click on find out more about configuring tables here, it actually takes us to Power Apps Maker, data platform, and then entity overview. So we've moved out into a different area. And that's because model-driven apps are, built on a data model, but the data model, a lot of the elements of the data model are described in this Dataverse area. So that's kind of what made it a little bit more tricky to work my way around. So we've talked about the glossary. I'm just going to move back to this landing page. So this landing page is quite important, and for the most part it reflects what you see on the left hand side in this left hand navigation around getting started. Now, it won't reflect in all respects, and the reason for that is because some of the elements, some of the places that you go to with regards to model-driven apps don't exist in the model-driven apps area. And I know it sounds strange, but it's one of these things that there are better places for describing this. We've already seen that tables are described in the data platform, but what you'll also see is, if I was to jump to share an app, and now that does actually exist within this area, but you will see that there are other areas that take you elsewhere. So if we just jump on to concepts, that probably, in fact that one actually does take us all the way to Power Platform admin environments overview. So it actually takes us outside of the model-driven app area, and that's because, look, they're important. If you want to get your head around model-driven apps, you're gonna have to be able to understand these elements here, and that's what the idea with it was. Looking at this get started piece and the whole idea of this is get started is like why even make model-driven apps? That's really why should we do this? What's the point? What are they? And so there was a piece in here that's really for anyone. It's not supposed to be sort of a kind of pro type area at all. It's for people who are just trying to find out about model-driven apps, and there was a lot of work put into the what are model-driven apps area so that it was actually accessible to people there. So what you'll find there are an awful lot of references out to the glossary in this area, so people can bounce out to these bite-sized ways of looking at things. But we talk about the benefits of the model-driven approach, comparing them to Canvas apps. That's really, really important to do that. And I'm not going to go into all the detail on that. A little bit on the steps to sharing, really trying to get people so that they actually might be able to kind of quick start themselves in this area. The benefits of the model-driven app, I really, really like this page. And the reason for that is because I actually reached out to the community and I said, well, hey, what do you think the benefits of the model-driven approach are? And this is what me and they and other people came up with. So some really interesting points there, and it's really important to remember, that these actually exist. But for the most part, there aren't lots and lots of new pages. They are just the same pages, but updated and moved around a little bit. One point I'd like to make here is around app development. It kind of splits into two. You actually see that there's app development here and there's advanced modeling. They, in reality, under the hood, they're kind of the same area. It's just that like you cannot make a good model-driven app without tables, forms, views, and relationships. You really are gonna really struggle. But actually, you don't necessarily need business rules, business process flows, embedding Canvas apps. So this is like a more advanced area to get into. We also talk a little bit about applying data visualization. So we're starting to get into sort of newer areas. There's the distribute, share and use area. We had that in the past, but there's a little bit on solutions there. We had that a little bit in the past as well. We're just putting them into what seems like the right area to use. And under the hood, what you'll actually see, there's a little bit more on how we deal with the kind of security side of things for model-driven apps. We point out to the developer zone because there are some really pro code sort of features that will be of interest to developers. And there's also elements of best practice. Now, this planning of Power Apps project, it doesn't exist in this area at all. It actually, it will take you all the way to the start of, this whole sort of Power Apps area. I'm not going to go into that. That's for you to look at for yourself. And then finally, there's resources, and then you really shouldn't forget Microsoft Learn, because they put so much into helping people understand more about Power Apps. The final thing that I want to mention is, actually it's not quite the final thing, I'll do two more things. Just the general style of the pages. So if I was to jump over to, say, something like define the data model for that, or maybe design the app interface. Let's move to work with views, for example. I'm just going to give the views overview and just scroll all the way down to next steps. Now, in the past, there were lots and lots of next steps, but for the most part, the way these next steps work is they will move you to the next item in the chain of events. So I didn't want people to feel bewildered about the 12 next steps that they need to make after they kind of learn a little bit. So the idea is that you kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to now move to the next steps, and you actually move. You don't move into a different area. You're pretty well staying in the same area. And similarly, you actually see that you actually move, directly on. So it was just felt like an easier way of moving people around, because sometimes the next steps took you to places that wouldn't necessarily be a next step, but that's a personal opinion. And finally, I want to talk to you about the navigation pane on the left-hand side. Now, there were some significant changes here, and that was really based around the idea that that we had an older app designer or older ways of creating views or forms, and that's now effectively gradually being replaced by a more modern process. Now, there's further to go with this, but roughly speaking, if you looked at something like working, if you look at this this area, particularly about designing the app interface, you'll notice that you can use the classic designers. So there's all these different bits and pieces about using the classic form editor and changing navigation within a form and how-to guides and all these sorts of things. But in actual fact, the more modern approach is actually delivered in the area that it's supposed to. So we are, for want of a better word, deprioritizing the classic designers in this case. And there will come a time when those classic approaches will no longer be needed, because effectively the unified interface view will have replaced it in all but the most minor respects. So that takes me to the end of the updates to the documentation. We looked at where to find the model-driven app documentation, why update it. I showed you the landing page. We looked at the glossary and saw how that was changing and how the structures changed. Effectively, that was the structure and the navigation structure. The model-driven apps, I just think you should always remember model-driven apps as being data model-driven apps. That really kind of it helps to understand why the documentation is as it is. I talked a little bit about new pages. There are some new pages, not very many, and also about how next steps work within the model-driven apps space. That takes us to the end, and I hope you find this video useful for understanding the updates that we've made, and do let me know any comments that you might have on this. Thanks. If you've enjoyed this video, then please click the subscribe, and you can even head over to www.powerplatformlearn.academy. There is lots and lots of content here, content around the Power Platform, a course here with 300 lessons on Canvas apps, and even a kids course on Power Apps. So do head over there and let other people know. I'll see you again soon.